There we go.
Vinny, welcome back. And for all of those listeners who have been following to learn a little bit more, we're coming into Brain Injury Awareness Month, and this just seemed like such a great time to talk to you, Vinny, about your own experiences, the challenges that you must face. We were talking at the break that one of the bigger challenges you face is you were so afraid of being perceived as disabled, even for yourself disabled, when your real fear was about how would you earn a living.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think, as we talked at the break, some of the challenges that face people with a brain injury is they don't look disabled. And so you've got some challenges, and you've had a few experiences where you've been perhaps not treated as kindly or as generously as we would hope. And I wonder if you could, share with the listeners today about what happens when you have a brain injury, when you don't look like you have a physical injury, which is obvious, a cast on an arm or a leg. So what's different for people who are facing this challenge, this hurdle? And what would you recommend for anyone who's maybe caregiving or working with a person who's dealing and coping with a brain injury at this time?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the first things that I would have to say about having a brain injury, which is an invisible injury for most people, unless they are in a coma or their body language changes drastically in some way. It's probably the constant feedback that comes, oh, but you look so good. Or you don't look as if you have a thing wrong with you. Are you sure you're not just faking? Are you doing this for the insurance? It's been a while, maybe this is all in your head. And so I think for many people who are walking this journey of concussion, mild brain injury, traumatic brain injury, it's the feeling that maybe really there isn't anything wrong with me, and maybe I'm going crazy.
Yeah. Especially when people tell you that your disability is all in your head, the fact that you can't speak, the fact that you can't put two sentences together. Maybe your short-term memory is gone. Maybe you can't remember how to make tea. I mean, there are such simple things, really, that so many people facing a brain injury have to relearn, that whole concussion syndrome. And, we've certainly heard about it changing football players' personalities and boxers who've been boxed in the head too many times, becoming depressed, despondent, and angry. Were your emotions ever affected by this brain injury?
So that's another really good question, Faith, and I'm glad you brought up the football connection to concussion. Certainly that has brought this whole area of brain injury to the forefront. But unfortunately, for some people who experience concussion or brain injury, they really don't look different. My awareness now of brain injury is that it really depends on what part of the brain has become broken or injured. In my particular situation, I sustained a left brain injury, and so I did not lose my memory. I was still able to do some of the day-to-day tasks, but I was not able to stand upright by myself. My balance was impacted. My ability to speak was impacted. And so I think for people who are not familiar with brain injury, for family, for friends who are trying to support or understand this person that they knew before the brain injury, it can sometimes be confusing because really the person may not look that different. They may be able to do some of the tasks that they were able to do before, but the brain, what is happening in the brain, they cannot see that often with certain kinds of injury, there may be really nausea and an inability to really find yourself in space. Spatial awareness is gone. There may be the loss of words. There may be the forgetting of names. In some people, depending on their type of injury, right brain injury, their emotions are hugely impacted by that. And they may have emotional outbursts that even they don't really recognize or are unable to control. And so for family, I think the best thing that they can do for a person or a family member who is living this journey really is to ask, how can I support you? What
what happens if the patient doesn't know how you can support them? You know, they're frustrated. Maybe they don't have the skills that you have and that you possessed going into this injury. I think your case is somewhat unique in terms of being able to hang on to some skills you had developed ahead of time. But what if you ask, it's kind of like a grieving person, you know, how can I help you? And their ability to think and problem solve has been affected. Then what?
So I think just walking with the person through the day-to-day ups and downs would be the best coaching that I could suggest, or advice that I could suggest. There are days when the fog is so thick that you're absolutely correct. I can't even think, or the person can't think. So I think just being able to walk the journey with the person, hear their frustration, the anger outbursts that some people will have, validate that this must be a very, very difficult place to be. I think the lack of validation is often another thing that sets many brain injured people back. The injury is not visible, and so there seems to be no rationale for why this person would be acting or behaving this way. So to help that person, maybe don't try to put it into a rationale that makes sense for you, but rather just to be able to be with that person and support them.
So just be present.
Be present with them.
You know, I often think of that with autistic or attention deficit kids. Sometimes our expectation is the reason we feel so much frustration.
Yeah.
And I would suggest perhaps that the brain injured individual, it is your expectation that is making you so impatient and so frustrated and so angry. So, you know, one of the greatest gifts perhaps is to help someone going through this journey to really come to terms with what new normal looks like, and to be more present and do what you can do.
What you can do, yes.
And once we were chatting once before this interview about that happening for you, and there was a story about cupboards and and
the cupboard, yeah.
Experience was. And I wonder if, you know, before we go to the next break, if you would mind sharing that story, because I think there's some real insights to be gleaned. At least there was for me when you mentioned it last time.
Well, you know, the cupboard story is a place in my journey where I think it was the lowest point, and I began to feel and act quite compulsive obsessive, or obsessive compulsive, whichever way those words go right now. And part of my ongoing post-concussion thing is sometimes words don't come out the way that they should, or I have the words in my head, but sometimes putting them together in a sentence that makes sense is not always consistent. But going back to the cupboards, yeah, I think, you know, that feeling of powerlessness, out of control, took over at that point. And I can vividly remember still sitting on my kitchen floor that particular day, tears streaming down my face, complete frustration, really angry, feeling quite useless and powerless, and what am I going to do with myself if this is my life, this is my new normal? And before this injury, I like to think of myself as a very organized person. Yeah. And so in my brain and in my emotions, I began to ask myself, well, what the heck can you do? And next thing I found myself literally pulling everything out of my kitchen cupboards. And it came to a point where I was just frantically pulling all of these things out, and I had this big mess of dishes and baking ingredients and you name it, you know what we all have in our cupboards, in my kitchen cupboards, and there it all was on the floor. And then I really lost it and started crying and thought, well, do what you can do. What can you do? Can you put 2 or 3 of these things back in the cupboard? Do you know where they go? Even does it matter where they go, as long as they find a place in the cupboard? And so I began to actually pick up these items and put things into the cupboard. It took me all day and then some, because I wasn't quite finished by the end of the day, around 6 o'clock. It had been about 6 hours. And I was actually so fatigued, my brain literally hurt because I knew I had overdone it. But I actually felt empowered because days, for weeks actually, every day I'd had somebody coming into my home to do something for me, take me somewhere, help me put my shower curtain up, bring the groceries, help me put the groceries away. And it was just so empowering that even though it took me all day and I had to really think about what each item was, where does this go, whereabouts in this cupboard and it didn't really matter where in the cupboard it went. It was just that I could put the item back in the cupboard. It felt so empowering. And that was when I began to switch my thinking a little bit to be able to think, do what you can do. If you focus on the things that you cannot do, that is so disempowering. It leads to a mindset of, I'm of no use to anybody, even myself.
You know, I think that you and I are singing from the same songbook. I believe that that's true even if you don't have an injury. I think that we often make our lives so complicated and our decision making so difficult on ourselves.
And I think as women, Faith, we are very...
And often a project or a task or a goal seems so unattainable. And if we could just breathe, take a moment, and really think about, what can I do right now? And and that it is, I love the metaphor of the cupboard, because it isn't that you have to put it in the cupboard in a specific way. Same as you don't have to do a task a specific way, as long as it gets done. Is that good enough? And sometimes the perfectionist and all of could learn a lot from that. So we're gonna pop over to a break again, and I am, one more time for those that checked in on the second half of this interview, I'm Faith Wood, Inspiring Minds Consulting, and I'm speaking to Vinny Gibson of Sunflower Transitions, and she's got some tips for us. So you're going to want to stay tuned after the break and check in on what are just a couple of really key takeaways and some different coaching strategies. This is all for Brain Injury Month, and I hope you're really enjoying it. Please see us again after the break.
Thanks, Faith. Talk to you soon.